Good evening. Tonight we begin with something darker than the usual stories of human ambition and scientific progress. This is the complete history of methamphetamine, the so-called super soldier drug that once promised relentless energy and became one of the most destructive substances of the modern era. Forget the Hollywood versions, the glamorized television dramas that turn tragedy into entertainment. The real story is far more complex, far more sobering, and far more human than any fiction could capture. This is a tale that spans continents and centuries, from ancient herbal remedies in the mountains of China to the laboratories of Imperial Japan, from the battlefields of World War II to the shattered communities of modern America. It's a story of wartime experiments and scientific ambition, of ruthless markets and policy failures, of human lives steadily unraveling under the weight of a chemical promise that turned into a curse. The truth is, if you were dropped into any chapter of this substance's rise, whether on a battlefield where it was handed out as a performance boost, in a laboratory where chemistry met commerce, or in a community left to cope with its devastating aftermath, you would quickly see how fragile the line is between medical breakthrough and social catastrophe. You would see how good intentions can pave roads to hell, how science without ethics becomes weaponized, and how societies struggling with complex problems often reach for simple chemical solutions that create far worse complications. Before we begin this journey through time and across borders, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in what we explore here. And please, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the global reach of these stories, by the fact that people from Tokyo to Toronto, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, are all grappling with the same questions about substances, policy, and human nature. Now, dim the lights, silence your phone, and prepare yourself. This is not a bedtime story that will soothe you to sleep. This is a history that demands attention, that asks difficult questions, and that refuses easy answers. Let's step into this complex, troubling, and ultimately human story together. The tale begins not in the sterile laboratories of 20th century pharmacology, not in the frantic workshops of wartime chemists, but quietly, humbly, in the dry highlands of Inner Asia and northern China, among small wiry shrubs that push stubbornly out of rocky soil. The plant was called ma huang by those who first harvested it, and it hung in bundles from the rafters of herbalist shops, dried to a brittle gold, smelling of dust and distance. For thousands of years before anyone dreamed of isolating molecules or patenting compounds, ma huang was simply medicine. Not medicine in the modern sense of standardized dosages and double-blind trials, but medicine in the older, quieter sense. A remedy that worked, passed down through generations, refined by centuries of careful observation. When the winter winds swept down from the steppes and settled into the chests of merchants and farmers, when the congestion of seasonal illness made breathing difficult and sleep impossible, the herbalists would prepare a decoction. They would boil the dried twigs in water, carefully controlling the temperature and steeping time according to knowledge inherited from their teachers. The resulting tea was astringent, bitter, clarifying. It opened the airways. It brought relief. The steam itself seemed to carry medicinal properties, a nasal clarity that people prized above gold during the long cold months of northern winters and the dusty caravans that crossed the vast interior of the continent. The physicians of the Han dynasty, writing their careful observations on silk scrolls that have somehow survived 2 millennia, described ma huang as a remedy for cough and congestion, for the heaviness of chest that accompanied fever. Later herbal compendia, the great encyclopedic works that attempted to catalogue the entirety of botanical medicine, advised decoctions of ma huang for asthma, for colds, for the fogged senses that came with illness. These were not superstitious practices or primitive guesses. They were the result of millennia of empirical observation, of noting what worked and what didn't, of refining techniques across countless generations. The medicine was modest, local, and folk-effective. It was a way of negotiating with nature, of finding relief in a world that offered few guarantees and little comfort. What those ancient compendia could not imagine, what no herbalist grinding the dried plant in a stone mortar could possibly foresee, was that within the leaf and twig lay a molecule that could be plucked out, isolated, amplified, and turned into an instrument of relentless wakefulness. They could not imagine that this humble remedy would one day fuel armies, devastate communities, and reshape global drug policy. They could not imagine that the gentle relief they provided to congested lungs would become, through the alchemy of modern chemistry, something far more powerful and far more dangerous. The story of how a traditional remedy became a global crisis is also the story of modernity itself, of how science transforms the world in ways both miraculous and terrifying, of how technology amplifies human capacities for both healing and harm. The transition from plant to pill, from traditional medicine to synthetic drug, required not just chemical knowledge but a complete transformation in how humans understood and manipulated the natural world. It required the development of organic chemistry as a discipline, the emergence of pharmaceutical corporations as economic entities, the creation of patent systems that turned knowledge into property, and the rise of modern states capable of regulating what their citizens could and could not consume. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded across decades, across continents, through the work of countless individuals, most of whose names are lost to history. But at certain moments, certain individuals, certain discoveries, accelerated the process and pointed it in new directions. In the late 19th century, as the Meiji Restoration transformed Japan from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial power, determined to compete with Western nations on equal terms, a Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi worked with Ma Huang, as one works with a stubborn, interesting puzzle in the dim afternoon light of a laboratory. Nagai had been trained in the new methods of analytical chemistry that Japan was importing wholesale from Europe and America. He had learned to see plants not as holistic organisms with inherent spiritual properties, but as chemical factories, as collections of discrete molecular compounds that could be separated, identified, named, and reproduced. Nagai opened Ma Huang to the analytic eye that this new chemical science was bringing to natural products. Working carefully, methodically, using techniques of extraction and crystallization that had been developed in German and French laboratories, he isolated from the plant a pure alkaloid compound. In the mid-1880s, he successfully extracted and identified ephedrine, giving it a proper scientific name derived from the plant's botanical classification. And in doing so, he executed what pharmacology had been promising since the days when alchemy began its slow transformation into chemistry. The conversion of a traditional remedy, effective but variable, into a single reproducible chemical entity that could be manufactured to exact specifications, that would behave the same way every time, that could be patented, branded, and sold. By naming and isolating ephedrine, Nagai did something that mattered far more than the extraction itself. He placed a botanical truth on the ledger of synthetic possibility. Once a compound is known, once its molecular structure is mapped and published in scientific journals, chemists across continents can see it, test it, tinker with it. They can imagine chemical relatives and synthetic rivals. They can, and they did, make new molecules. The path from ephedrine to methamphetamine is in one narrow sense a short chemical journey. The two molecules are closely related structurally. Methamphetamine is simply ephedrine with a slight modification, a small change in its molecular architecture that dramatically amplifies certain effects while diminishing others. But in another sense, the path from ephedrine to methamphetamine is a long story of laboratories and international travel, of scientific papers exchanged by post across oceans, of the mechanical clatter of patent offices processing applications, and the quiet industrial hum of pharmaceutical presses beginning their work. Nagai's careful separation of plant alkaloids entered the literature of organic chemistry, and that literature moved through the networks of the age, the journals and conferences that linked Tokyo to Berlin and London, professors to their graduate students, corporations to their in-house research teams. Knowledge flowed along these channels, accelerating, amplifying, transforming as it went. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period when the chemistry of alkaloids, those nitrogen-containing compounds found in plants that have such profound effects on human consciousness and physiology, became not just a respectable field of academic inquiry but a measurable, profitable business. The industrial appetite for isolable, patentable molecules was growing brisk and urgent. Pharmaceutical companies, a new kind of enterprise that stood at the intersection of science, medicine, and commerce, were eager for new sympathomimetics, new bronchodilators, new tonics that they could sell to physicians faced with the distinctly modern conditions that industrial civilization was producing. Sleep disorders, urban fatigue, the nasal congestion that came from living in increasingly polluted cities that were getting busier, dirtier, and more crowded by the year. It was precisely in this context of scientific enthusiasm and commercial appetite that a second Japanese chemist, Akira Ogata, refined what had been merely a curious laboratory sketch into a form fit for a pill bottle and a prescription pad. Around 1919, working with the methodical precision that characterized the best pharmaceutical research of the era, Ogata found a practical way to produce a crystalline hydrochloride form of the compound. This crystalline salt, when properly dosed and administered, produced powerful stimulant effects. That crystallization represented more than just a piece of clever laboratory craft. It was the moment when a molecule became fungible, became commercial, became dangerous. It became easy to weigh with precision, easy to ship in bulk, easy to store for long periods without degradation, and therefore crucially easy to sell. A freebase compound that is oily and temperamental, that degrades quickly and varies in potency, remains largely an object of academic interest, discussed in journals and tested in small laboratory experiments. But a crystalline salt that sits stable in a glass vial like a tiny white promise, that can be manufactured to exacting standards and packaged in attractive bottles with professional labels, that is something for the commerce pages of newspapers. That is something that can be marketed to doctors and prescribed to patients. That is something that can make fortunes. Suddenly the pathway from marijuana to mattress to market was not metaphorical but literal. A plant growing on distant mountainsides, an isolated alkaloid extracted in a Japanese laboratory, a further laboratory conversion into a more potent form, and finally a stable pharmaceutical salt that could be counted on, that physicians could trust, that patients could take home in a brown glass bottle with printed instructions. Science, of course, did not proceed in a vacuum, isolated from the political and economic forces that shaped the modern world. The Meiji period in Japan had deliberately and systematically linked the island nation's chemists into a transnational conversation with their European and American colleagues. This was part of a larger national project of modernization and strengthening, of ensuring that Japan would not be colonized or dominated by Western powers. And by the early 20th century, a globalizing pharmaceutical industry centered in Europe and the United States was desperately hungry for compounds that promised both novelty and, crucially, novelty's commercial twin, proprietary control through patents. Patenting practices in the early 20th century had matured considerably from their 19th century origins, evolving alongside industrial capitalism itself. Pharmaceutical firms sought not merely to discover new compounds, but to own them, to brand them with memorable names, to advertise them aggressively in medical journals and popular magazines. The chemistry that Nagai and Ogata practiced, therefore, touched not just the realm of pure science, but also the legal and commercial frameworks of their day, the structures of intellectual property law that were being hammered out in patent offices from Tokyo to Washington to Berlin. A crystalline salt of a newly synthesized compound could be patented in multiple jurisdictions, creating a web of legal protections that could extend for decades. And a patent conferred not just commercial exclusivity, not just the right to be the sole manufacturer and seller, but also something more subtle and powerful, the language of legitimacy. Patent protection gave marketing departments the vocabulary they needed to claim a place in physicians' cupboards and patients' medicine cabinets. The markets were ready, primed, waiting. The first decades of the 20th century had transformed people into consumers not just of food and clothing, not just of entertainment and transportation, but also increasingly of sleep and attention, of mood and energy. These fundamental aspects of human experience were being reconceptualized as commodities that could be purchased, managed, optimized through chemical intervention. Hospitals and clinics were adapting to new diagnostic categories that pharmaceutical companies were helping to define and popularize. Doctors found themselves tasked with curating modern life, with helping their patients cope with the pressures of industrial rhythms and the exigencies of a world that seemed to be speeding up with each passing year. Pharmaceutical companies, some still small family operations but others already multinational corporations with offices on multiple continents, smelled opportunity in the air like sharks scenting blood in water. They had learned, through trial and error, and increasingly sophisticated marketing research, how to take a fixed chemical formula, wrap it in an attractive trade name that suggested scientific precision and medical authority, and deliver it to doctors as a reliable instrument for treating the ailments of modern life. The chemistry they promised would do the rest. It was a compelling pitch. A marriage of laboratory precision and entrepreneurial zeal transformed what had been a traditional herbal remedy into a compound that could be produced at industrial scale, stamped with a trademark that conveyed ownership and quality, and pushed into the expanding lanes of scientific medicine and modern daily life. By the 1930s, that push had gathered considerable speed and momentum. The transformation of methamphetamine from a laboratory curiosity discussed only in specialized chemistry journals to a widely prescribed medicine occurred under the attentive eye of advertising agencies and the less obviously coercive, but no less powerful force of professional medical endorsement. In clinics scattered across the industrialized world, and in the pages of medical journals that doctors read to stay current with the latest developments, the new stimulant was presented as a precise scientific treatment for a range of specific modern complaints. Narcolepsy, that mysterious and dangerous condition in which individuals would suddenly collapse into sleep at unpredictable moments, often with devastating consequences. Depression, the persistent melancholy and lack of energy that modern life seemed to bring to an ever-growing number of people who found themselves unable to function in the demanding environments of factories and offices. Obesity, increasingly understood not just as a moral failing, but as a medical and social problem that many physicians and their anxious patients were attempting to address through appetite suppressants that promised weight loss without the difficulty of dietary changes. And the perennial universal nuisance of nasal congestion, which the factories and crowded cities of the industrial age had not managed to cure through legislation or improved ventilation. Pharmaceutical firms, always ready with a carefully chosen trade name and a memorable tagline, rolled out their methamphetamine products with the confident assuredness of those who had thoroughly learned the rules of the medical marketplace. The names they chose were designed to convey genteel promise and scientific sophistication. Methadone in the English-speaking world, a name that sounded clinical and modern. Philipon in Japan, where the domestic pharmaceutical industry was developing its own brands and marketing strategies. Pervitin in Germany, where the substance would soon play a particularly dark role in military history. These products were presented to the medical profession as precise shots of chemical clarity, as small diamonds of pharmaceutical function that doctors could confidently drop into a patient's treatment regimen, secure in the knowledge that they were prescribing something modern, scientific and effective. The commercial practices of the era mattered enormously to how these molecules were perceived by both doctors and patients. Pharmaceutical firms trained specialized sales representatives, creating what would become a standard feature of medical practice for the rest of the century. These well-dressed, articulate salespeople would visit physicians' offices on regular schedules, armed with samples and literature. They would leave specimens in pockets and drawers, small starter supplies that doctors could distribute to patients for free, creating early positive experiences with the drugs. They learned to speak the correct professional jargon about dosing regimens and clinical indications, positioning themselves not as mere salespeople but as educators, as conduits of the latest scientific knowledge. The representative from a pharmaceutical company would typically arrive with a booklet of clinical studies, often small and anecdotal by later standards, but presented with scientific authority, along with personal endorsements from doctors at respected hospitals, testimonials that carried weight in an era when medical practice still relied heavily on the judgment and experience of respected practitioners. Advertising took another, more public route, reaching directly into what scholars would later call the patient-practitioner dyad, through medical journals that doctors subscribed to, and in some countries with more relaxed regulations, through consumer-facing magazines and newspapers. There were glossy, colorful advertisements that promised relief and restoration. There were smaller, more sober notices that conveyed scientific precision through their very restraint. There were published case studies that claimed dramatic results in a handful of carefully selected patients and sometimes subtly and sometimes not, that the rest of the medical profession simply had not been paying adequate attention to this remarkable breakthrough. The medical culture of the 1930s and 1940s was, we must acknowledge with the benefit of hindsight, gently credulous in ways that later decades, chastened by scandal and tragedy, would not be. Physicians were trained primarily to act, to intervene, to do something for suffering patients who came to them seeking relief. They had in many clinics and hospitals far fewer therapeutic options for treating persistent fatigue and mood disorders than we sometimes imagine when looking back from our current era of numerous antidepressants and mood stabilizers. The diagnostic categories themselves were more fluid, less rigidly defined. Neurasthenia, a diagnosis that would later be abandoned as too vague and subjective, was still being taught at many medical schools as a legitimate condition. Melancholia, that old poetic name for severe depression, still had beds reserved for it in asylums and outpatient psychiatric clinics, and many sufferers of what we would now recognize and treat as clinical depression or anxiety disorders received stimulant prescriptions because stimulants worked quickly, producing visible results within hours or days rather than the weeks required for many modern antidepressants, and quick, observable results were a currency that physicians valued highly, both for their patients' sake and for their own professional satisfaction. the immediate relief of mental fog that came with stimulant use, the rapid loss of appetite in a patient determined to shed unwanted weight. These were visible, measurable outcomes that could be documented in patient charts and discussed with colleagues. The long-term consequences, the potential for dependency and addiction, the cardiovascular risks, the psychological toll of chronic use, these were far less easily tabulated in the short-term clinical trials that were then the standard for evaluating new medicines. Truly enormous social and economic forces were pushing stimulant prescriptions into normal medical practice, making them seem not experimental or risky, but simply part of the modern therapeutic arsenal. The Great Depression, that catastrophic economic collapse that had thrown millions out of work and destabilized societies across the industrialized world, had perversely increased the appetite for small medical miracles that promised energy without rest, productivity without adequate nutrition, the ability to keep going when circumstances suggested that rest and recovery were impossible luxuries. Factories recovering from the Depression years desperately wanted workers who could stay awake through long shifts, who could maintain focus and productivity even when exhausted. Offices wanted alert clerks who could process the growing mountains of paperwork that modern bureaucracies generated. And homemakers, facing the unrelenting demands of managing households without the servants that earlier generations of middle-class women had relied upon, wanted an edge, a boost that would help them manage the exhausting chores of modern domestic life, while also meeting the rising standards of cleanliness and child-rearing that popular magazines promoted. Doctors who specialized in psychiatry and those in general practice both learned to write prescriptions for these stimulants, sometimes for their patients, sometimes, it must be said, for themselves. Medical professionals were not immune to the pressures and exhaustions of modern life, and the easy availability of pharmaceutical solutions made self-medication a constant temptation. Tonics, stimulants, pick-me-ups, these became a legitimate therapeutic category, discussed seriously in medical journals and taught as appropriate interventions in medical schools. There was also, we must note, a striking ease in the regulatory frameworks of many countries during this period. Before the more rigorous controls of the post-World War II era, before the tragedies and scandals that would eventually force governments to take a much harder look at pharmaceutical marketing and prescribing practices, many stimulants were available with nothing more than a physician's signature on a prescription pad, and in some formulations and jurisdictions they could even be purchased over the counter, no questions asked. The absence of modern pharmacovigilance systems, the lack of organized post-market surveillance and adverse event reporting, meant that clinical practice could evolve by professional habit and commercial pressure more than by rigorous evidence. Doctors prescribed what other doctors were prescribing, what the pharmaceutical representatives recommended, what seemed to work in the short term for their patients. Marketing strategies worked hand in glove with prescribing patterns, each reinforcing the other in a feedback loop that drove consumption steadily upward. Advertisements for weight loss products leaned heavily on the aesthetic and social anxieties of the time, on the growing cultural emphasis on slimness as a marker of self-control, modernity, and attractiveness. Women's magazines carried before and after photographs and glowing testimonials that read remarkably like the testimonials of later diet culture fads, promises of transformation that appealed to deep insecurities about body image and social acceptance. Medical journals, meanwhile, printed controlled trials, small and often disappointingly short-term by modern standards, that nonetheless verified the appetite suppression and mood elevation effects of methamphetamine. These studies, however limited, gave doctors the scientific cover they needed to feel that they were practicing evidence-based medicine, rather than simply following commercial trends. Sales representatives left generous samples in the hands of physicians and sometimes even in the waiting rooms where anxious patients, leafing through magazines while waiting for their appointments, might encounter promotional materials and ask for the new treatment by name. A pill that allowed a woman to lose weight without the apparent hardship of strict dieting could be described and prescribed as genuinely therapeutic, as addressing a medical problem. A tablet that kept a night shift factory worker alert and productive could be prescribed as pragmatic, as helping someone meet the demands of modern economic life. Dependence was a word that had not yet consolidated its current clinical specificity and moral weight. It was used when it was used at all, vaguely, imprecisely. Habit and overuse were terms that appeared only in passing in the small studies and case reports that appeared in specialty journals read by a handful of experts, not in the mainstream medical literature that most practicing physicians relied upon. Elsewhere in the world, beyond the clinics and pharmacies of America and Europe, The pharmaceuticalization of methamphetamine took different forms that reflected local pharmaceutical industries, local medical cultures, and local social desires. In Japan, Philipon appeared on the market, distributed by industrial-scale manufacturers who had built their businesses around the production of synthetic compounds, and it seeped into both medicine cabinets and increasingly into other realms of Japanese society. The substance found its way into the hands of workers in the rapidly rebuilding post-war economy, students preparing for the brutally competitive entrance examinations that determined their entire future prospects, and eventually into underground markets that would emerge in the aftermath of World War II. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the post-war epidemic that would sweep through Japan and eventually force a global reckoning with methamphetamine, we must first turn to the battlefield, to the most destructive conflict in human history, where methamphetamine would be deployed not as a medicine, but as a weapon, as a tool for creating soldiers who could fight beyond the normal limits of human endurance. The Second World War represented the first truly industrial total war of the modern era, a conflict in which the lines between civilian and military, between economic production and battlefield effectiveness, largely dissolved. Every resource of the participating nations was mobilized and directed toward the singular goal of victory. And among those resources, among those tools that were deployed with ruthless pragmatism, were pharmaceutical stimulants. Methamphetamine in particular became what some historians have called a quintessential weapon of 20th century warfare, perfectly suited to the demands of mechanized combat that required soldiers to remain alert, aggressive, and operational for days on end without rest. The drug enabled a kind of warfare that previous generations could not have sustained, battles that raged continuously without the natural pauses that darkness and exhaustion had once imposed. In Nazi Germany, Pervitin became so widespread in military use that some historians have argued it fundamentally shaped German military doctrine and battlefield tactics in the early years of the war. The substance was manufactured by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company and distributed to German forces on a scale that is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Millions of tablets were produced and issued. Soldiers received them as part of their standard field rations. Tank crews, pilots flying long missions, infantry engaged in the rapid advances of Blitzkrieg warfare, all were supplied with Pervitin to keep them awake, alert and willing to push beyond the normal physiological limits. The drug helped make possible the stunning German victories of 1939 and 1940, the rapid conquests of Poland, France and the Low Countries that shocked the world. Armies that had been expected to bog down in traditional grinding warfare instead moved with unprecedented speed, covering distances that military planners had thought impossible, fighting through nights that should have provided respite and recovery time. The tactical advantages were obvious and immediate. Soldiers on methamphetamine could march longer distances without complaint, could remain at their posts through the long, terrifying hours of night combat when exhaustion typically made men vulnerable and ineffective. They experienced a suppression of normal fear responses, a chemical courage that made them more willing to take risks, to press attacks even in the face of withering defensive fire. They felt invincible, superhuman, capable of anything. And for a time in the short term that military planners focused on, these effects seemed like pure advantage, like a technological breakthrough, as significant as any new tank design or aircraft engine. But the German military and medical establishment were not blind to the problem. As the war ground on, as the early victories gave way to prolonged campaigns and eventual defeats, the consequences of widespread methamphetamine use became impossible to ignore. Soldiers developed tolerance, requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same effects. They experienced severe crashes when the drug wore off, periods of profound exhaustion and depression that left them temporarily useless for combat. Some developed full-blown addiction, becoming unable to function without regular doses. Others experienced psychotic episodes, paranoid delusions, violent outbursts that made them dangers to their own units. Medical officers began filing reports about the problems they were seeing, the steady deterioration of men who had been using Pervitin for extended periods. By 1941, the German military had begun to recognize that they had created a significant problem. Official policies were introduced to restrict and regulate the distribution of methamphetamine, to limit doses and duration of use. But these policies ran up against the brutal reality of total war. Commanders facing desperate tactical situations, soldiers enduring conditions of extreme stress and danger, they continued to use the drug because the short-term advantages seemed to outweigh the long-term costs. because survival tomorrow mattered more than health next year. The Eastern Front in particular, with its vast distances, brutal conditions and grinding warfare of annihilation, saw continued heavy methamphetamine use throughout the war, policies and regulations notwithstanding. Nor was this phenomenon limited to German forces. Allied militaries also experimented with and deployed pharmaceutical stimulants, though generally with somewhat more caution and less enthusiastic embrace than the Germans had shown. American forces used amphetamines, a closely related compound, distributing them to pilots on long-range bombing missions, to soldiers in the Pacific Theater, fighting in conditions of extreme heat and humidity, to anyone facing situations where alertness and endurance were critical. The British military similarly supplied amphetamines to its forces, particularly to Royal Air Force pilots flying exhausting missions over occupied Europe. Japanese forces, drawing on their domestic pharmaceutical industry, made extensive use of methamphetamine throughout their campaigns in China and the Pacific. The Japanese military's distribution of Philipon to its soldiers and pilots was systematic and extensive, contributing to the fighting effectiveness that American forces found so difficult to overcome, but also contributing to the erratic, sometimes suicidal behavior that characterized some Japanese military operations, particularly as the war turned decisively against them. The wartime use of methamphetamine by multiple nations' military forces had profound consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Millions of young men were introduced to the drug under circumstances of extreme stress and official sanction. They learned that methamphetamine could help them function under impossible conditions, could suppress hunger and fear and exhaustion. They learned to associate the drug with survival, with performance, with doing one's duty. And when the war finally ended, when these millions of veterans returned to civilian life, many of them brought their habits and their knowledge with them. They returned to societies that were themselves traumatized, disrupted, struggling to rebuild. They returned to economies that could not immediately absorb them, to families that had been fractured by years of separation, to a world that seemed profoundly changed and uncertain. And they knew where they could find a chemical that would help them cope, that would give them energy and confidence. That was, they had been taught, a legitimate tool for managing difficult circumstances. The immediate post-war period saw the emergence of the first major civilian methamphetamine epidemics, particularly in Japan and Germany, the two defeated Axis powers where military stockpiles of the drug were suddenly available, and regulatory structures had collapsed. In Japan, the problem became so severe that it prompted the first serious international discussion of methamphetamine control. The Japanese government by the late 1940s was facing what officials described as a national crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens, possibly more than 1 million, were using methamphetamine regularly. The drug had spread from veterans to factory workers to students to housewives. It was readily available on the black market, where enterprising dealers had seized on military surplus, and on the relatively simple chemistry required to manufacture the drug clandestinely. Small laboratories began appearing, producing methamphetamine from legally available precursor chemicals, distributing it through networks that reached into every major city and many smaller towns. The social consequences were devastating. Families were torn apart by addiction. Workers became erratic and unreliable. A wave of methamphetamine-induced psychosis filled psychiatric hospitals with patients experiencing paranoid delusions and violent behavior. Crime rates increased as addicts sought money for their habits and as the black market in methamphetamine generated violence over territory and supply. The Japanese government responded with a combination of law enforcement and public health measures. They criminalized unauthorized possession and sale, imposing harsh penalties including significant prison terms. They launched public education campaigns warning about the dangers of the drug. They attempted to restrict access to the precursor chemicals used in clandestine manufacture. And gradually, over the course of the 1950s, they brought the epidemic under a measure of control, though at considerable social cost and never eliminating the problem entirely. The Japanese crisis served as a warning to other nations and contributed to growing international momentum for drug control measures. The post-war period saw the creation of new international institutions and treaties aimed at regulating dangerous substances. The United Nations in its early years took up the question of drug control as part of its broader mandate to promote health and security. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, negotiated through the 1950s and finally adopted in 1961, represented an attempt to create a comprehensive international framework for controlling substances deemed to have high abuse potential and limited medical value. Methamphetamine was included in the schedules of controlled substances, though with recognition that it retained some legitimate medical uses under proper supervision. Individual nations, meanwhile, were developing their own regulatory responses, shaped by their particular experiences and political cultures. In the United States, the 1950s and 60s saw growing concern about amphetamine and methamphetamine abuse, driven partly by sensationalized media coverage of beatniks and truck drivers and housewives using pep pills, and partly by genuine public health concerns as doctors and researchers began documenting the long-term consequences of chronic stimulant use. The medical establishment, which had once enthusiastically embraced these drugs, began pulling back, becoming more cautious about prescribing them, more aware of the risks. Regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration began imposing stricter controls on manufacture and distribution. Law enforcement agencies began treating unauthorized possession and sale as serious criminal matters rather than minor infractions. But regulation always lagged behind chemistry. This became one of the defining patterns of the methamphetamine story, a pattern that continues to the present day. As governments moved to control pharmaceutical methamphetamine to restrict legitimate manufacture and prescribing, they inadvertently created enormous economic incentives for illicit production. The drug was not particularly difficult to manufacture for anyone with basic chemistry training and access to the necessary equipment and precursor chemicals. The profit margins in illegal drug markets were astronomical, far higher than anything available in legitimate business. And demand remained strong because the drug created dependency, because users found it difficult or impossible to stop, because new users continued to be recruited by the promise of energy, weight loss, confidence, all the things that pharmaceutical companies had once advertised openly. The history of methamphetamine from the 1960s onward becomes in large part a history of this game of chemical cat and mouse, between regulators attempting to control the drug and manufacturers finding new ways to produce and distribute it. It becomes a history of evolving production methods, of shifting geographical centers of manufacture, of changing patterns of use and routes of distribution. It becomes a history of policy responses that often seem to make the problem worse rather than better, that drove production and use underground without reducing demand, that filled prisons with users and low-level dealers while leaving the fundamental dynamics of the market largely untouched. The story moves from pharmaceutical factories to motorcycle gang clubhouses, from hospital pharmacies to clandestine laboratories in remote rural areas, from doctors' prescriptions to street-level dealing in urban neighborhoods devastated by deindustrialization and disinvestment. In the United States, the 1960s and 70s saw the emergence of what law enforcement called biker meth, methamphetamine manufactured by outlaw motorcycle gangs who had the organizational capacity, the chemical knowledge, and the distribution networks to operate at scale. Groups like the Hells Angels became major players in the methamphetamine trade, manufacturing the drug in makeshift laboratories, often in remote locations where detection was difficult, and distributing it through networks that reached across state lines. The product quality was variable, often impure, sometimes contaminated with toxic byproducts of sloppy manufacturing processes, but it was cheap and widely available, and it found ready markets among users who could no longer obtain pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine through legal channels. The manufacturing process itself evolved in response to regulatory pressure. Early illicit manufacturers had relied on diverting pharmaceutical methamphetamine, or on obtaining pharmaceutical-grade precursor chemicals through fraud or theft. As these sources were increasingly cut off by regulation and enforcement, manufacturers developed new synthesis routes using different precursor chemicals that were less tightly controlled. The ephedrine and pseudoephedrine found in over-the-counter cold and allergy medications became favored starting points. Manufacturers would purchase these medications in bulk, extract the active ingredient, and use relatively straightforward chemical processes to convert it to methamphetamine. The resulting product, when made by competent chemists, could be quite pure and potent, virtually indistinguishable from pharmaceutical methamphetamine. This led to a new wave of regulation targeting the precursors themselves. Governments began restricting sales of medications containing ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, requiring identification for purchases, limiting the quantities that could be bought at one time, creating databases to track purchases and identify individuals buying suspicious quantities. Pharmacies moved these products behind the counter, making them less convenient to obtain. Some jurisdictions banned them entirely or required prescriptions. But again, regulation created new opportunities for creative evasion. Smurfing operations emerged, where manufacturers would employ numerous individuals to make small legal purchases from many different locations, accumulating enough precursor material for large-scale production. International supply chains developed, with precursor chemicals being manufactured legally in countries with lax regulations and then smuggled to countries where they were controlled. The geography of methamphetamine production shifted repeatedly in response to enforcement pressure and market dynamics. Mexican drug trafficking organizations, which had long dominated the cocaine and heroin trades, saw opportunity in methamphetamine and brought their considerable resources and expertise to bear. By the 1990s and 2000s, Mexican cartels had become the dominant suppliers of methamphetamine to the United States market. They operated large-scale laboratories, sometimes called super labs, capable of producing hundreds of pounds of high-purity methamphetamine in a single production run. They established sophisticated supply chains for obtaining precursor chemicals, often importing them from manufacturers in China and India. They developed distribution networks that reached into communities across the United States, from major cities to small rural towns. The Mexican cartels brought a level of professionalization and scale to methamphetamine production that the biker gangs had never achieved. They employed skilled chemists who could reliably produce high-purity product. They invested in quality control, understanding that consistent purity and potency built customer loyalty, and reduced enforcement risk by minimizing overdoses and other adverse events that might attract police attention. They developed sophisticated smuggling operations to move the drug across the border, using everything from cross-border tunnels to drones to human couriers. And they used violence, systematic and brutal violence, to control territory, eliminate competition, and intimidate anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement. The result was a dramatic increase in the availability and decrease in the price of methamphetamine across much of the United States. By the early 2000s, methamphetamine had become what drug policy analysts call a commodity drug: cheap, widely available, and relatively standardized in quality. This commodification had profound public health consequences. More people used the drug because it was easier to obtain and more affordable. The average purity increased, meaning users were consuming more of the active drug with each dose, increasing the risks of addiction, overdose, and adverse health effects. And the drug spread geographically, moving from its traditional strongholds in the West and Southwest into regions that had previously seen little methamphetamine use. At the same time, patterns of use were evolving in ways that increased harm. Smoking methamphetamine became increasingly common, replacing oral consumption and nasal insufflation as the preferred route of administration for many users. Smoking delivers the drug to the brain more rapidly, producing a more intense rush, a more powerful euphoria, but also creating stronger dependency and more severe consequences. The rapid onset and short duration of effects from smoking encourages binge patterns of use, with individuals using repeatedly over periods of days, experiencing severe sleep deprivation, nutritional deficiency, and psychological disturbance. The physical and mental health consequences of this pattern of heavy use are severe, and often long-lasting. The public health system struggled to respond effectively to the changing methamphetamine landscape. Treatment programs designed primarily for heroin and cocaine users found that their approaches often did not work well for methamphetamine addiction. There were no medications proven effective for treating methamphetamine dependency, no equivalent to methadone or buprenorphine for opioid addiction. Behavioral therapies could be effective but required sustained engagement that many chaotic, impoverished methamphetamine users found difficult to maintain. The cognitive impairment that resulted from chronic methamphetamine use made treatment more difficult, as did the psychiatric symptoms, the depression and anxiety and sometimes psychosis that persisted even after users stopped taking the drug. Communities, particularly rural and small-town communities that lacked robust public health infrastructure, found themselves overwhelmed. The visible signs of methamphetamine use, the dramatic physical deterioration of chronic users, the erratic and sometimes violent behavior, the neglect of children by addicted parents, all of this generated intense social anxiety and demands for action. But the action that communities most often demanded, and that politicians most often supplied, was more law enforcement, more arrests, longer prison sentences, more resources devoted to supply interdiction and dealer prosecution. The logic was straightforward and superficially appealing. Methamphetamine was a scourge destroying lives and communities. The people manufacturing and selling it were criminals who deserved harsh punishment. The solution was to arrest them, to incarcerate them for long periods, to make the penalties so severe that rational people would be deterred from entering the trade. But this logic, however appealing, consistently failed to account for the fundamental economics and social dynamics of drug markets. The methamphetamine trade, like all illegal drug trades, operated according to principles that made traditional deterrent strategies largely ineffective. The enormous profit margins meant that there were always new people willing to take the risks, willing to step into the roles of arrested dealers and manufacturers. The decentralized nature of distribution networks meant that removing one player, even a significant player, did little to disrupt the overall market. Demand remained essentially constant, driven by the pharmacological properties of the drug itself, by the dependencies it created, by the social and economic conditions that made the drug appealing to people seeking escape, energy, confidence, or simply a way to cope with lives that felt unbearable. Incarceration, rather than solving the problem, often made it worse. Prisons became universities of drug knowledge, places where dealers shared techniques, where users maintained and deepened their connections to drug networks, where people emerged more damaged and more deeply embedded in criminal culture than when they entered. The collateral consequences of drug convictions, the barriers to employment and housing and education that followed people after release, made successful reintegration extraordinarily difficult, and made return to the drug trade an economically rational choice for many. Families were fractured by incarceration, with children of imprisoned parents facing dramatically elevated risks of poverty, educational failure, and eventual involvement in the justice system themselves. Communities were destabilized by the mass removal of large numbers of adults, predominantly young men, to distant prisons. The cultural construction of methamphetamine and methamphetamine users during this period deserves careful attention because it shaped policy in profound ways and continues to influence public perception and political response to the present day. Methamphetamine became in popular culture and political rhetoric the ultimate demon drug, the substance that represented everything frightening about drugs and drug users. The imagery was vivid and disturbing. Before and after photographs showing the dramatic physical deterioration of users, the hollowed faces, rotted teeth, scarred skin, became ubiquitous in anti-drug campaigns and news coverage. Stories of users engaging in bizarre and violent behavior while high, of parents neglecting or abusing children, of individuals disassembling electronics or picking at their skin for hours. These stories were repeated endlessly, creating a portrait of methamphetamine users as fundamentally different from normal people, as having crossed some boundary beyond which they became almost alien, incomprehensible, and frightening. This cultural construction was not entirely false. Chronic methamphetamine use does cause severe physical and psychological damage. The drug is neurotoxic, causing long-term changes in brain chemistry that can persist for months or years after cessation of use. It causes cardiovascular damage, dental problems, skin issues, severe weight loss. The behavioral changes associated with chronic use, the paranoia and compulsive behaviors and emotional volatility, these are real and often distressing to witness. But the dominant cultural narrative went beyond simply documenting these harms. It constructed methamphetamine users as a class apart, as having voluntarily chosen to become monsters, as deserving of their suffering and unworthy of compassion or assistance. This narrative served important political and psychological functions. It allowed the broader society to distance itself from the problem, to see methamphetamine addiction as something that happened to other people, different people, people who made bad choices and had to live with the consequences. The reality, of course, was far more complex and far more ordinary. Most people who used methamphetamine did not fit the extreme stereotypes. Many were functioning users who held jobs and maintained relationships, who used the drug for energy or weight control, or simply because they enjoyed it, who managed their use at levels that did not immediately destroy their lives. Even among those whose use became clearly problematic, the path to that point was usually gradual and comprehensible. People started using methamphetamine for reasons that made sense in their contexts: to work longer hours at low-wage jobs, to lose weight in a culture obsessed with thinness, to cope with depression or trauma, to fit in with peers, to experience pleasure in lives that offered few other sources of joy. The progression from casual or controlled use to dependency and chaos was not inevitable, but it was also not mysterious or incomprehensible. The drug created powerful reinforcement through its effects on brain chemistry. Tolerance developed, requiring higher doses, the pleasures of use gradually gave way to the need to use simply to feel normal, to avoid the crushing depression and exhaustion of withdrawal. Understanding this progression does not require seeing users as fundamentally different or flawed. It requires seeing them as human beings responding, sometimes poorly and self-destructively, to the combination of a powerful drug and difficult life circumstances. But this understanding, this humanizing perspective, was largely absent from public discourse and policy making during the peak years of the methamphetamine crisis. Instead, the dominant response was punitive and moralistic. Users were criminals who needed to be arrested and incarcerated. Dealers and manufacturers were monsters who deserved the harshest penalties available. Treatment was often coerced and punitive in character, focused more on punishment and surveillance than on genuine therapeutic support. And prevention efforts relied heavily on scare tactics, showing young people the most extreme consequences of use and expecting them to simply say no, despite decades of evidence showing that fear-based prevention has limited effectiveness. The methamphetamine crisis also intersected in complex ways with existing social inequalities and prejudices. In the United States, methamphetamine use was initially concentrated in white, rural communities, in the declining small towns and rural areas that had been economically devastated by the collapse of manufacturing, the consolidation of agriculture, the flight of young people to cities seeking opportunity. This demographic pattern created an interesting dynamic. On one hand, the fact that methamphetamine was seen as a white drug, a rural drug, helped generate some level of public sympathy and calls for treatment rather than pure punishment. The families affected were often portrayed as tragic victims of economic forces beyond their control, as decent people who had turned to drugs out of desperation. This contrasted markedly with the way crack cocaine, which was concentrated in black urban communities, had been discussed a decade earlier, with far less sympathy and far more emphasis on personal responsibility and criminal justice responses. On the other hand, the association of methamphetamine with white rural poverty also allowed urban elites and coastal progressives to distance themselves from the problem, to see it as something afflicting those backward rural areas, those people who voted the wrong way politically, those communities that clung to outdated values and industries. There was often a subtle undercurrent of classism and cultural contempt in discussions of the methamphetamine crisis, a sense that these communities had brought their problems on themselves through poor life choices and political decisions. This made it easier to underfund treatment and prevention programs, to focus resources on law enforcement rather than public health interventions, to write off entire regions as lost causes. But the demographic and geographic patterns of methamphetamine use were never as simple as the stereotypes suggested. While use was indeed high in rural white communities, it was also significant in Native American communities on reservations, among certain Latino populations, in some urban neighborhoods. Methamphetamine did not respect boundaries or stay neatly within the categories that media narratives assigned to it. And over time, as the drug became cheaper and more available, as Mexican cartels expanded their distribution networks, methamphetamine spread more broadly across the social and geographic landscape. By the 2010s, it was no longer possible to maintain the fiction that methamphetamine was primarily a rural white problem. It had become a truly national crisis, affecting communities of every type, users of every demographic category. The human toll of this crisis is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Tens of thousands of people have died from methamphetamine overdoses, with the death rate increasing dramatically in recent years, as methamphetamine has become more potent, and as users have increasingly combined it with opioids, a particularly dangerous combination. But the death toll captures only the most visible and final consequence. For every person who dies, there are many more who survive, but live with profound damage to their health, their relationships, their economic prospects, their ability to function in the world. The cognitive impairment caused by chronic methamphetamine use can persist for years, affecting memory, decision-making, impulse control, the very capacities that people need to rebuild their lives. The cardiovascular damage increases risks of heart attack and stroke, often in people still relatively young. The dental destruction, while it may seem superficial, carries serious health consequences and creates barriers to employment and social interaction in a society that judges people heavily on their appearance. The impact on children is particularly devastating and particularly difficult to fully measure. Children growing up in households where parents use methamphetamine experience neglect, instability, exposure to dangerous people and situations, and often abuse. They experience trauma that will shape their development and their own life trajectories in ways that may not become fully apparent for years. Many enter the foster care system, which is often overwhelmed and under-resourced, unable to provide the intensive support that traumatized children need. Many eventually become involved with drugs themselves, repeating patterns they learned in childhood, coping with unprocessed trauma through the same mechanisms their parents used. The intergenerational transmission of addiction and trauma is one of the most intractable aspects of the methamphetamine crisis, creating cycles that are extraordinarily difficult to break. Communities as collective entities suffer damage that goes beyond the sum of individual harms. High rates of methamphetamine use erode social trust, make public spaces feel dangerous, discourage investment and economic development, strain public services beyond their capacity to respond effectively. Schools struggle to educate children who are traumatized, unstable, or themselves using drugs. Police departments find themselves overwhelmed by calls related to drug use and drug markets, by property crime committed to fund drug purchases, by domestic violence and child abuse cases involving parents impaired by drug use. Hospitals and emergency rooms treat the medical consequences of methamphetamine use, the overdoses and psychotic episodes and cardiovascular emergencies, often providing expensive care to patients who have no insurance and no ability to pay. Social service agencies attempt to support families in crisis, to provide housing and food assistance and case management, but find that the resources available are completely inadequate to the scale of need. The economic costs are staggering. Direct costs include law enforcement and criminal justice expenditures, the costs of incarceration, the costs of child welfare systems dealing with children removed from homes, the costs of medical treatment for addiction and its consequences. Indirect costs include lost productivity, as users drop out of the workforce or become unreliable employees, the foregone tax revenue from reduced economic activity, the property damage and theft that accompany drug markets. Some economists have attempted to calculate total social costs, producing figures that run into the tens of billions of dollars annually in the United States alone. But these calculations, however sophisticated, cannot capture everything. How do you assign a monetary value to the dissolution of a family, to a childhood spent in chaos and fear, to the human potential that is never realized because addiction cut it short? Different communities have responded to the methamphetamine crisis in different ways, shaped by their resources, their political cultures, their prior experiences with drug problems. Some have doubled down on law enforcement, attempting to arrest their way out of the crisis, creating local drug task forces and prosecution programs focused on aggressively pursuing dealers and users. These communities typically see some short-term reductions in visible drug activity as markets are disrupted and participants are incarcerated. But they almost never see sustained improvements, because the underlying dynamics that create demand remain unchanged, and new participants emerge to fill the roles of those who are arrested. And they pay enormous costs in the expansion of their criminal justice systems, in the social damage caused by mass incarceration, in the opportunities foregone because resources are devoted to punishment rather than prevention or treatment. Other communities have attempted to emphasize treatment and public health responses, creating or expanding addiction treatment programs, implementing needle exchange programs to reduce disease transmission, training first responders in overdose prevention and response, attempting to connect users with services rather than simply arresting them. These communities typically see better long-term outcomes, with gradual reductions in use, in crime, in disease transmission, in overall social harm, but they face significant political challenges. Treatment and harm reduction programs are often controversial, opposed by people who see them as enabling drug use, as sending the wrong message, as being soft on crime. They require sustained funding and political will, which can be difficult to maintain when the results are gradual and not dramatic, when success is measured in people who slowly stabilize their lives, rather than in dramatic rescues and transformed communities. The evidence from decades of research and practical experience points clearly toward the superiority of public health approaches over purely punitive ones. Every major scientific and medical organization that has examined drug policy has concluded that addiction should be treated primarily as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, that treatment and harm reduction are more effective and more cost-effective than incarceration, that prevention programs should be evidence-based rather than ideological. But translating this evidence into policy has proven extraordinarily difficult, because drug policy is not made by scientists and public health experts, but by politicians responding to public opinion and political pressures, by law enforcement agencies with institutional interests in maintaining and expanding their roles, by media organizations that find dramatic crime stories more compelling than gradual public health improvements. The complexity of treating methamphetamine use disorder reflects both the pharmacological properties of the drug and the social contexts in which use occurs. Methamphetamine creates dependency through multiple mechanisms. It causes powerful neurochemical changes, particularly affecting dopamine systems in the brain, that create intense cravings and make natural rewards feel diminished in comparison to the drug high. It becomes deeply associated with particular people, places, and situations through conditioning processes, so that encounters with these cues trigger cravings and use urges even after extended periods of abstinence. It serves psychological functions, helping users cope with negative emotions, providing confidence and energy, creating a sense of belonging within user communities. And it becomes integrated into daily routines and survival strategies, particularly for people in poverty who may use it to work longer hours at demanding jobs or to suppress appetite when food is scarce. Effective treatment must address all of these dimensions. It must help people through the acute withdrawal period, which, while not medically dangerous like opioid or alcohol withdrawal, can be extremely unpleasant, with severe depression, exhaustion, and cravings that can last weeks. It must help people develop new coping strategies for the emotions and situations that triggered their drug use. It must help them rebuild their lives in concrete ways, finding housing and employment and reconnecting with family, creating alternatives to the drug-centered life they are leaving behind. It must help them avoid or manage encounters with cues and situations that trigger cravings, and it must provide ongoing support through the extended period of recovery, recognizing that addiction is a chronic condition that requires long-term management, not an acute problem that can be fixed with a short-term intervention. The most effective treatment approaches are comprehensive and sustained. Contingency management, which provides concrete rewards for negative drug tests and treatment engagement, has strong evidence of effectiveness for methamphetamine addiction. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people identify and change thought patterns and behaviors associated with drug use. Motivational interviewing helps people explore their ambivalence about change and strengthen their commitment to recovery. Community reinforcement approaches help people build lives where natural rewards compete with drug rewards. Residential treatment programs provide safe, structured environments where people can focus on recovery away from the cues and stresses of their usual environments. All of these approaches work better when they are delivered by skilled, well-trained providers who genuinely care about their clients and who are given adequate resources and reasonable caseloads. But the treatment system in most places falls far short of this ideal. Providers are overworked and underpaid, leading to high burnout rates and difficulty attracting and retaining qualified staff. Funding is unstable and inadequate, forcing programs to operate on shoestring budgets and to turn away people who need help. Treatment is often coercive, mandated by courts or child welfare agencies, which complicates the therapeutic relationship and reduces effectiveness. Programs frequently have rules and requirements that make completion difficult, discharging people for minor infractions rather than treating such lapses as part of the recovery process. The separation between addiction treatment and other healthcare services means that people with co-occurring mental health or medical problems often fall through the cracks, unable to get integrated care that addresses all their needs simultaneously. The social determinants of addiction and recovery are often ignored in treatment approaches that focus narrowly on individual behavior change. People are discharged from residential treatment back to the same environments and circumstances that contributed to their addiction, with little support for addressing the fundamental problems of poverty, unemployment, unstable housing, trauma, and lack of opportunity. They are expected to maintain recovery while living in neighborhoods where drugs are readily available and heavily marketed, where many of their social connections are with other users, where legitimate economic opportunities are scarce. They face enormous barriers to employment because of their addiction histories and criminal records, making it difficult to achieve the financial stability that supports recovery. They confront stigma and discrimination that makes it harder to access housing, education, and other resources. The reality is that successful recovery from methamphetamine addiction often requires not just individual change but social change, not just treatment but transformation of life circumstances. This is why recovery rates are higher among people with more social and economic resources, why middle-class users with family support and employment prospects fare better than impoverished users facing multiple adversities. It is not that the latter group is less motivated or less deserving, it is that they face much more difficult circumstances and have access to far fewer resources to support their recovery efforts. A comprehensive response to methamphetamine addiction would address these structural factors, investing not just in treatment programs but in the economic and social conditions that support health and recovery. Some communities have developed innovative approaches that attempt to address addiction more holistically. Housing-first programs which provide stable housing without requiring sobriety as a precondition recognize that people need basic stability before they can successfully engage in treatment. Supported employment programs help people find and keep jobs while still in recovery, recognizing that meaningful work and economic security are crucial to long-term success. Peer support programs employ people in recovery to provide support and mentorship to others, drawing on the unique credibility and understanding that comes from shared experience. Medication-assisted treatment programs, while lacking proven medications specifically for methamphetamine, often serve polysubstance users and can address co-occurring opioid or alcohol dependence, while providing a structure of regular contact and support that benefits overall recovery. The growing recognition of addiction as a chronic disease rather than an acute condition or a moral failing has important implications for how we think about treatment and recovery. Chronic diseases like diabetes or hypertension are managed over long periods, with the understanding that symptoms may wax and wane, that occasional setbacks do not represent treatment failure, that ongoing care and monitoring are necessary. Applying this model to addiction suggests that we should expect recovery to be a long process with ups and downs, that return to use should be treated as a symptom requiring adjustment of the treatment plan rather than as a failure warranting discharge from care, that people may need ongoing support and periodic interventions for years or even indefinitely. From an economic perspective, success might be measured in terms of rigorous cost-benefit analyses, comparing the costs of various interventions to the monetized value of outcomes they produce. This approach has the advantage of forcing explicit consideration of opportunity costs and trade-offs that are always present, but often ignored in policy debates. Every dollar spent on one intervention is a dollar not available for other uses, whether other drug policy approaches or completely different social priorities like education, infrastructure, or healthcare for other conditions. Rational policy should direct resources where they will do the most good, where the benefits most exceed the costs, where society gets the greatest return on its investment. Economic analyses have consistently shown that treatment is far more cost-effective than incarceration in addressing drug use. The costs of residential treatment, even intensive long-term treatment, are a fraction of the costs of imprisonment, when all direct and indirect costs are included. And treatment has benefits: reduced drug use, improved health, increased employment and productivity, reduced crime, that generate value far exceeding the costs. Cost-benefit studies typically find that every dollar invested in addiction treatment returns several dollars in social benefits. Similar analyses of harm reduction interventions like needle exchange programs and naloxone distribution show extremely favorable cost-benefit ratios, with modest investments producing large benefits through prevented disease transmission and prevented deaths. But economic cost-benefit analysis also has serious limitations when applied to drug policy and addiction treatment. Many of the most important outcomes are difficult or impossible to monetize meaningfully and defensibly. How do you put a dollar value on a life saved, on a child who grows up with a parent in recovery rather than in active addiction, on a community that maintains its social fabric rather than being torn apart by drug-related problems? Economists have developed various methods for valuing life and health, but these methods rest on controversial assumptions and produce values that many people find either too high or too low depending on their perspective. A statistical life valued at several $million may seem astronomical to some and grossly inadequate to others who believe human life is priceless. And even when monetization is possible and accepted, the distributional questions remain stubbornly important. An intervention might have positive net benefits overall, producing more total value than it costs, while concentrating costs on one group and benefits on another. This raises questions of fairness and justice that cost-benefit analysis alone cannot resolve. If an intervention saves money for taxpayers but imposes costs on people who use drugs, or if it benefits the general public while burdening a particular community that hosts the facility, is it just? How should we weight costs and benefits that fall on different groups, particularly when some groups are already disadvantaged and vulnerable? Cost-benefit analysis treats all dollars equally regardless of who gains or loses them, but most ethical frameworks suggest that benefits to the poor and disadvantaged should count more than benefits to the wealthy, that harms imposed on vulnerable populations are more serious than harms to those with resources to cope. From the perspective of affected communities, success looks different still from any of these expert-defined metrics. What communities want, what they see as success, is visible order and safety. They want to be able to walk through their neighborhoods without encountering drug dealing and drug use in public spaces. They want public parks where children can play without finding discarded needles. They want local businesses to thrive rather than being driven out by crime and disorder. They want to see neighbors and family members recovering, getting their lives back together, becoming productive and stable again. They want young people in the community to have alternatives to drug use, to see positive paths forward, to have hope for the future. These are legitimate and important goals that reflect genuine community needs and aspirations. But these community desires can sometimes conflict with effective harm reduction approaches that may increase visible signs of drug use even while reducing harms. Safe consumption sites, for example, where people can use drugs under medical supervision with immediate intervention available if they overdose, have been shown conclusively to reduce overdose deaths and connect people with treatment and other services. But they also concentrate drug use in particular locations, making it highly visible to neighbors and passers-by. They may attract drug users from surrounding areas, increasing the perceived drug problem in the immediate vicinity. Community residents may feel that their neighborhood is being sacrificed, being turned into a dumping ground for a problem that society has failed to solve, that their quality of life is being reduced for the greater good of people who live elsewhere. These tensions between different ways of defining and measuring success create ongoing political conflicts that shape drug policy in profound ways. Law enforcement agencies emphasize metrics that justify their budgets and approaches, generating statistics about seizures and arrests that suggest aggressive enforcement is working and needs continued or expanded resources. They frame opposition to their approaches as being soft on crime, as failing to protect communities, as prioritizing drug users over law-abiding citizens. Public health advocates point to overdose death rates and disease transmission statistics to argue for harm reduction and treatment expansion, framing enforcement-focused approaches as ineffective and counterproductive. Economists conduct studies showing that treatment is more cost-effective than incarceration, attempting to shift debates onto terrain where technical expertise can provide clear answers. But conservative critics argue that such cost-benefit studies systematically undervalue deterrence effects and public safety, that they fail to capture the moral and social value of holding people accountable for harmful behaviors, that they treat drug use as merely a health issue when it is also a moral and social issue, with implications for communities and families. Community groups demand visible action that addresses their immediate concerns about disorder and safety, even when research suggests that the most effective interventions may be less dramatic and visible, may work slowly over time, may even initially increase visible drug activity before ultimately reducing it. And people who use drugs themselves, whose perspectives and voices are often entirely excluded from policy discussions despite being most directly affected, might define success very differently than any external observers. People who use drugs might define success as being treated with dignity and respect by healthcare providers and law enforcement, rather than being stigmatized and dehumanized. They might define it as having access to safe, predictable drug supplies, so they know what they are consuming, and can use more safely. They might define it as not being forced into abstinence-based treatment when they are not ready to stop using, but instead having access to services that help them use more safely and address other problems in their lives. They might define it as not being arrested and incarcerated for what they see as personal choices that harm no one but themselves. They might define it as having their basic needs for housing and food and healthcare met regardless of whether they continue to use drugs. These perspectives are rarely centered in policy discussions, yet they represent the lived experience of the people most affected by drug policies and their consequences. Reconciling these profoundly different perspectives and definitions of success requires honest acknowledgement that they reflect different values and priorities, not just different empirical beliefs that could be resolved with more research and better data. Some of these disagreements are about facts about what interventions actually work to reduce various harms, and these empirical questions can in principle be answered through rigorous research. But many of the disagreements go deeper, to fundamental questions about values that cannot be resolved through empirical investigation alone. Some people prioritize individual liberty above almost everything else, believing that competent adults should be free to make their own choices about what substances they consume, even when those choices are harmful, as long as they are not directly harming others. From this perspective, drug prohibition is fundamentally illegitimate, an unjustified intrusion of state power into personal decisions. The harms of use, even severe harms, are the user's own business and responsibility. Others prioritize public order and community welfare, believing that individual liberty must be balanced against social consequences, that society has both the right and the duty to prevent behaviors that create significant externalities. Drug use is not simply a personal choice but a social problem with ripple effects. Families are harmed by addiction, children suffer neglect, communities are destabilized. In this view, society has the obligation to discourage drug use through various means, including criminal penalties. Some people emphasize compassion and harm reduction above all, wanting to help people who use drugs reduce negative consequences even if they continue using, believing that any reduction in harm is valuable, and that no one should be written off or abandoned. From this perspective, the goal is not to eliminate drug use, which may be impossible, but to minimize suffering and death, to treat people with dignity regardless of their choices, to meet people where they are, rather than imposing conditions that many cannot meet. Others emphasize accountability and deterrence, wanting to create consequences that discourage drug use and hold people responsible for their choices. Removing consequences through harm reduction approaches sends the wrong message, suggesting that society condones drug use. The moral imperative is to uphold standards, to distinguish clearly between acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, to ensure that people face consequences for choices that harm themselves and others. These are not disagreements that can be resolved through more data or better studies, though evidence can certainly inform how we think about these value questions and their practical implications. They are fundamentally about what kind of society we want to be and how we balance competing goods and competing harms. They are about whether we weight individual liberty more heavily than collective welfare, whether we prioritize reducing harm over enforcing accountability, whether we believe in meeting people where they are or insisting they meet certain standards before receiving help. Reasonable, well-informed, compassionate people can and do disagree on these questions, reflecting different moral frameworks, different life experiences, different intuitions about human nature and social responsibility. The most promising approaches to the methamphetamine crisis, based on decades of evidence from research and practical experience across many different contexts, involve portfolio strategies that draw on multiple frameworks and interventions rather than relying on any single approach or ideology. This means acknowledging that different interventions serve different purposes, and that a comprehensive response requires all of them working together in a coordinated system. It means maintaining some level of enforcement against large-scale trafficking organizations and violent drug markets, while not filling prisons with low-level users and dealers, whose incarceration accomplishes little beyond ruining their lives and damaging their communities. It means greatly expanding treatment capacity and improving treatment quality to help people who want to stop or reduce their use, while also implementing robust harm reduction programs for people who are not ready or able to achieve abstinence, but who can still benefit from interventions that help them use more safely and address other problems in their lives. It means addressing the social and economic conditions that make drug use appealing or functional for many people, investing in education and employment and housing and healthcare and community development, creating the conditions where people have genuine opportunities and alternatives. It means holding individuals accountable for behaviors that harm others, like driving under the influence or child neglect, while recognizing that addiction itself is a health condition rather than simply a moral failing. It means involving affected communities in developing solutions, respecting their legitimate concerns about order and safety, while also respecting the rights and dignity of people who use drugs and ensuring that community concerns do not simply become a veto over any intervention that involves visible acknowledgement that drug use occurs. It means being willing to experiment with new approaches and to learn from both successes and failures, following the evidence wherever it leads rather than clinging to ideological commitments that have repeatedly proven ineffective. It means looking carefully and honestly at what has worked in other places and contexts, learning from the experiences of countries like Portugal and Switzerland and Canada and the Netherlands that have implemented different approaches with documented better outcomes, while also recognizing that context matters enormously, and that what works in one place may need to be adapted significantly to work in another with different political culture, different social structures, different resources. It means being humble about the limits of our knowledge and the complexity of human behavior, recognizing that there are no perfect solutions, that every approach involves trade-offs and unintended consequences, that we will inevitably make mistakes and need to course correct based on experience and new evidence. Such portfolio approaches are politically difficult because they lack the simple clarity and emotional resonance of zero-tolerance enforcement or pure harm reduction. They cannot be summarized in catchy slogans or reduced to simple talking points. They do not offer the satisfying narrative of good versus evil, heroes versus villains, that enforcement-focused approaches provide, nor the uncomplicated compassion and moral clarity of approaches that focus solely on helping people without any element of accountability or limit setting. They require sustained investment across multiple domains simultaneously: treatment and prevention and enforcement and economic development and education and social services, with all the coordination challenges and bureaucratic turf battles that multi-sector approaches inevitably entail when agencies have different missions, different funding streams, different performance metrics, different organizational cultures. They require coordination across agencies and levels of government that often operate independently and sometimes work at cross purposes, with federal and state and local jurisdictions each having different laws, different priorities, different political pressures. They require partnerships between government and non-profit organizations and private sector actors, each with their own constraints and motivations. They require breaking down silos between criminal justice and public health and social services, between law enforcement and treatment providers, between researchers and practitioners, creating communication channels and shared goals that often do not naturally exist. They require patience and long-term commitment, because results emerge gradually over years and decades, not dramatically and immediately in ways that satisfy electoral cycles or media attention spans. Overdose death rates may take considerable time to decline as new interventions are implemented and scaled up and as their effects accumulate. Crime rates may initially increase in some areas as enforcement shifts focus from street-level arrests to higher-level trafficking, before eventually declining as treatment and prevention efforts take hold. Visible disorder may persist or even increase temporarily in some neighborhoods as harm reduction interventions concentrate drug use in particular locations to provide services, before ultimately reducing as people are connected to treatment and support. Communities may not feel safer immediately, even when actual safety is measurably improving according to objective indicators. Politicians implementing such approaches need to be able to explain these complex dynamics to constituents, to help people understand why short-term indicators may not reflect long-term progress, why things may seem to get worse before they get better, why patience is required. They need to maintain political support for approaches whose benefits may not become fully apparent or widely appreciated until after the next election cycle, possibly until after they have left office. This requires unusual political courage and long-term thinking in systems that typically reward short-term results and punish anything that can be portrayed as failure. They require political leadership willing to defend complex, nuanced approaches against critics who will always be able to point to particular failures or problems as evidence that the entire approach is misguided. Any comprehensive approach implemented at scale will involve some interventions that do not work as hoped, some investments that do not pay off as expected, some unintended consequences that create new problems even as they solve others. Critics operating in bad faith or simply with different ideological commitments can always find anecdotes and examples to hold up as evidence that the approach is failing, can always find individual tragedies to suggest that different policies would have prevented them, can always argue that any problem or setback is evidence that we should return to approaches that are simpler and more familiar, even if decades of experience show they do not work and often make things worse. And portfolio approaches require public support from citizens who understand that there are no perfect solutions to complex social problems, that trade-offs are inevitable, that the goal should be to reduce harms overall and improve outcomes on average, rather than to eliminate drug use entirely, or to ensure that no one ever suffers negative consequences from drug use or drug policy. This requires a level of public education and sophisticated understanding that is extraordinarily difficult to achieve in a media environment that favors simple narratives and dramatic stories over complex analysis and nuance, that rewards outrage and conflict over careful explanation, that gives disproportionate attention to individual tragedies while ignoring broader patterns and trends. It requires rebuilding trust in institutions and experts that has been badly eroded over recent decades by repeated policy failures, by scandals and corruption, by broken promises, by the perception that elites are out of touch with the concerns and experiences of ordinary people. It requires a willingness among the public to see people who use drugs as human beings deserving of dignity and support rather than as moral failures or dangerous criminals, who have only themselves to blame for their situations and who deserve whatever consequences befall them. The physical health problems associated with chronic methamphetamine use, cardiovascular damage that increases risk of heart attack and stroke, even in relatively young people, severe dental destruction that creates both health problems and social stigma, malnutrition and dramatic weight loss, skin infections from compulsive picking, infectious diseases transmitted through injection drug use. All of these require medical attention and resources that are often not available or not accessible to people living in poverty and chaos. The healthcare system is not well designed to serve people with active addiction. Appointments must be made in advance and kept reliably. Multiple visits may be required for diagnosis and treatment. Medications must be taken as prescribed. Follow-up care must be completed. All of these requirements assume a level of stability and organization that many people with severe addiction do not have. Harm reduction services have expanded significantly in many jurisdictions over the past decade and particularly in the past few years, representing genuine and important progress in public health approaches to drug use and a shift, however incomplete and contested, toward treating drug use as primarily a health issue rather than purely a criminal justice matter. Needle exchange programs, once highly controversial and relatively rare, now operate in hundreds of locations across North America, though they remain illegal or restricted in some jurisdictions and are constantly vulnerable to political attacks from conservatives who view them as enabling drug use, and from community groups who object to their presence in their neighborhoods. These programs serve multiple functions beyond the basic provision of sterile injection equipment. They prevent disease transmission, certainly, reducing the spread of HIV and hepatitis C among people who inject drugs, but they also serve as crucial contact points, places where people who use drugs can interact with healthcare workers and social workers, where they can access other services, where they can have conversations about safer use practices and about treatment options when and if they are ready to pursue them. Naloxone distribution has become widespread, genuinely widespread in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago, with the overdose reversal medication now available in many states without prescription from pharmacies, distributed through community organizations and harm reduction programs provided to people who use drugs and their families and friends and loved ones. Police officers and firefighters and emergency medical technicians carry it routinely. Some public places, libraries and community centers and transit stations have naloxone kits available like fire extinguishers or automated external defibrillators. Public health tools available for anyone to use in an emergency. Training in how to recognize an overdose and administer naloxone has been provided to hundreds of thousands of people. These naloxone distribution programs have unquestionably saved tens of thousands of lives, probably more, allowing bystanders and peers to reverse opioid overdoses before emergency responders arrive, or in situations where people might be reluctant to call for emergency help because they fear legal consequences. But the widespread need for naloxone distribution, while a testament to the success of a harm reduction intervention, is also itself a symptom and marker of a much deeper crisis, of drug supplies increasingly contaminated with fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, of people using alone in isolation because stigma and criminalization prevent them from using with others who could help if something goes wrong, of an overdose epidemic that shows no signs of abating despite enormous investments of resources and attention. Naloxone saves lives in the critical moment of overdose, but it does nothing to address the underlying conditions that create overdose risk in the first place: the contaminated drug supply, the social isolation, the desperation, the lack of access to treatment, the prohibition that makes drugs unpredictable and dangerous. Safe consumption sites, also called supervised injection facilities or overdose prevention sites or drug consumption rooms depending on the jurisdiction and the political sensitivities involved, where people can use drugs under medical supervision with immediate intervention available if they overdose, have been implemented successfully and studied extensively in Canada, various European countries including Germany and the Netherlands and Switzerland and Australia. The evidence base for their effectiveness is now overwhelming, and comes from multiple countries and contexts and research designs. They prevent overdose deaths by ensuring medical supervision and immediate response capability. They reduce disease transmission by providing sterile equipment and space for safe injection practices, and by connecting people with healthcare services. They reduce public drug use and publicly discarded needles by providing an alternative to using in parks and alleys and public restrooms, addressing community concerns about disorder. They connect people with treatment and other services more effectively than almost any other intervention, because they provide regular non-judgmental contact between people who use drugs and healthcare and social service providers who can offer help when people are ready. And crucially, contrary to the fears that opponents always raise, they do all of this without increasing drug use in the surrounding community or among program participants. Studies consistently show that safe consumption sites do not lead to increased drug use, do not attract new users to the area, do not cause increases in crime. If anything, they are associated with reductions in public disorder and crime as drug use moves indoors and as people are connected with services that address their underlying needs. The evidence is clear and consistent across multiple sites and multiple countries over decades of operation and study. But despite this overwhelming evidence, safe consumption sites remain illegal at the federal level in the United States, classified as drug paraphernalia under federal law, subject to prosecution under the so-called crack house statute that prohibits maintaining any place for the purpose of using illegal drugs. This prohibition exists despite the evidence, despite the recommendations of virtually every major medical and public health organization, despite the success of such sites in other countries with similar legal and cultural contexts. It represents a clear and troubling case where ideology and politics and moral opposition to drug use trump evidence and public health, where legal barriers prevent implementation of interventions that could and would save lives if they were allowed to operate. Some jurisdictions have explored creative workarounds, establishing what they carefully call overdose prevention centers or harm reduction centers or wellness centers that provide similar services under different names and different legal theories, operating in legal gray areas, hoping that federal prosecutors will exercise discretion and not bring charges, knowing that they are vulnerable to shutdown at any moment if political winds shift or if a high-profile incident occurs that generates negative publicity. This legal uncertainty makes it difficult to operate openly and at scale, difficult to publicize services to the people who need them most, difficult to establish the stable funding and staffing that would allow programs to operate most effectively. The federal prohibition creates constant risk and prevents the open, fully legal operations that would be most effective and most able to serve people who need help. Drug checking services, which allow people to test their substances for contaminants and adulterants before using them, have expanded in some areas but remain inaccessible to most people who could benefit from them, and face ongoing legal ambiguity and political opposition in many jurisdictions. These services range from very simple, the distribution of fentanyl test strips that people can use to check whether a substance contains fentanyl, to quite sophisticated, using spectrometry equipment or other analytical chemistry techniques to provide detailed analysis of substance composition, identifying not just the presence or absence of particular compounds, but their relative concentrations and the presence of cutting agents and adulterants. When people know what they are actually consuming, when they have accurate information about what drugs are present and in what amounts, they can make more informed decisions about whether and how to use. They can adjust their doses to account for unexpected potency. They can avoid substances that contain particularly dangerous adulterants or unexpectedly high concentrations of potent drugs. The public health case for drug checking is straightforward and compelling. In a world where drug supplies are unregulated and unpredictable, where contamination with fentanyl and other potent synthetic opioids is increasingly common, where people cannot know from appearance or taste or smell what they are actually consuming, drug checking provides crucial information that can prevent overdoses and deaths. It is harm reduction in its purest form, not trying to prevent drug use but trying to make drug use safer for people who are going to use regardless. But drug checking faces legal barriers in some jurisdictions where providing such services could be construed as facilitating illegal drug use, where the equipment used for testing might be classified as drug paraphernalia, where prosecutors or law enforcement might view the services as problematic even if no specific statute clearly prohibits them. And it faces practical barriers of cost and accessibility, the expense of sophisticated testing equipment and the trained personnel to operate it, the challenge of making services available where and when people need them, before they use drugs rather than after. The criminal justice system continues to process staggering numbers of drug cases, despite growing recognition, even among some prosecutors and judges and law enforcement officials themselves, of the severe limitations and often counterproductive effects of incarceration-focused approaches to drug use. Hundreds of thousands of people are arrested annually for methamphetamine-related offenses in the United States alone, with arrests for possession, for low-level dealing, for paraphernalia, clogging courts and filling jails and prisons. Many tens of thousands are incarcerated, many of them for substantial periods of years, for possession offenses or low-level dealing, for violations of probation or parole related to drug use, cycling in and out of correctional facilities in patterns that accomplish little beyond disrupting their lives and damaging their prospects for successful reintegration into society. The collateral consequences of drug convictions, the barriers and restrictions and disqualifications that follow people long after they have served their sentences and supposedly paid their debt to society, continue to create nearly insurmountable obstacles to successful reintegration and recovery. People with drug conviction records face barriers to employment, with many employers unwilling to hire people with criminal records. With some professions legally closed to people with drug convictions, they face barriers to housing, with public housing authorities and many private landlords refusing to rent to people with drug records. With some finding themselves effectively shut out of legal housing markets, they face barriers to education, with drug convictions affecting eligibility for financial aid and admission to educational programs. They face loss of professional licenses, loss of driver's licenses in some states, ineligibility for various public benefits. These barriers persist for years or decades, making it extraordinarily difficult for people to build stable, productive lives after release from incarceration. Some jurisdictions have implemented meaningful reform measures in recent years, representing genuine if incomplete progress toward more rational and humane drug policies. Drug courts have been established in many areas, offering treatment as an alternative to incarceration for people who plead guilty and agree to comply with program requirements including regular drug testing, frequent court appearances, participation in treatment, and various other conditions. Diversion programs route some people arrested for drug offenses to treatment or other services instead of prosecution, attempting to interrupt the cycle of arrest and incarceration. Some states and localities have reduced penalties for simple possession offenses, reclassifying them as misdemeanors rather than felonies, reducing maximum sentences, eliminating some of the collateral consequences. Some have eliminated or reduced some of the barriers that drug convictions create, restoring access to public benefits or professional licenses or educational opportunities. These reforms represent progress and have helped some people avoid the most destructive consequences of criminalization, have given some people opportunities for treatment and recovery that they might not otherwise have had. But the reforms have been limited and uneven, implemented inconsistently across jurisdictions, often with significant restrictions and conditions that limit their reach and impact. And fundamentally, the basic structure of prohibition remains firmly intact, with all its attendant harms that flow directly from the illegality of drugs rather than from the drugs themselves or from problematic use patterns. As long as drug production and distribution remain illegal and unregulated, supplies will remain unpredictable and contaminated. Violence will remain inherent in the resolution of disputes that cannot be resolved through legal mechanisms. People will remain afraid to seek help or call for emergency assistance when needed. Enormous resources will continue to be consumed by enforcement and incarceration rather than being available for prevention and treatment. The social and economic conditions that make methamphetamine use appealing or functional or seemingly necessary for many people have, if anything, deteriorated significantly further over recent decades, creating the fertile ground in which drug problems grow and flourish. Economic inequality has increased dramatically across developed nations, and particularly starkly in the United States, reaching levels not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, when robber barons accumulated unprecedented wealth, while workers struggled in poverty. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else, between those who have benefited enormously from globalization and technological change and financial deregulation and those who have been left behind or actively harmed by these forces, has widened to the point where it threatens social cohesion and democratic governance. Wages for working-class jobs, the jobs that do not require college degrees, that involve manual labor or routine service work, have stagnated in real terms for decades, failing to keep pace with productivity increases or with the rising costs of housing and healthcare and education. A single income that once could comfortably support a middle-class family, that could pay for a home and a car and healthcare and occasional vacations and save for retirement and children's education, now leaves many families struggling to meet basic needs, even with two full-time incomes. The manufacturing jobs that once provided stable, relatively well-paid employment for people without advanced education, that came with benefits and pensions and some measure of security, have largely disappeared, moved overseas to countries with lower labor costs or automated away through technological advances that have eliminated far more jobs than they have created. These lost manufacturing jobs have been replaced primarily by service sector jobs in retail, in food service, in healthcare support, in logistics and warehousing, jobs that typically pay less, offer fewer benefits, provide less security and predictability, offer fewer opportunities for advancement. The gig economy, celebrated by some as offering flexibility and entrepreneurial opportunity, more often delivers precarity and exploitation, with workers classified as independent contractors to avoid labor protections and benefit requirements, facing irregular hours and unpredictable income, unable to plan or save, constantly scrambling to patch together enough work to survive. Young people entering the workforce face the prospect of being the first generation in American history to be worse off economically than their parents, burdened with crushing student debt taken on in the promise of better opportunities, unable to afford homes in the markets where jobs are concentrated, delaying or abandoning plans to marry or have children because they cannot afford to, watching the traditional markers of adult stability and success recede further into the distance. Communities, particularly rural communities and deindustrialized cities in the Rust Belt and elsewhere, have been economically hollowed out, their economic bases destroyed by forces beyond local control, their young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, those who remain facing limited prospects and declining public services as tax bases shrink. Main streets that once bustled with locally owned businesses now feature empty storefronts and dollar stores and payday lenders. Schools struggle with inadequate funding and cannot provide the education that might give young people paths to better opportunities. Hospitals and clinics close, leaving people to travel long distances for healthcare or to go without. Infrastructure crumbles, roads and bridges and water systems deteriorating for lack of the tax revenue to maintain them properly, visible symbols of communities in decline. Social institutions that once provided support and meaning and connection, the churches and unions and civic organizations and fraternal societies that gave people's lives structure and tied them into communities, have weakened dramatically as participation has declined across the board. Union membership has collapsed from over a third of workers in the 1950s to barely 1 in 10 today, eliminating not just a source of economic protection and bargaining power, but also a crucial institution for social connection and political mobilization. Religious participation has declined, particularly among younger generations, removing another source of community and meaning and support for many people. Civic organizations from Rotary clubs to bowling leagues have seen membership plummet. People are more isolated, more atomized, more disconnected from the communities and institutions that once gave their lives meaning and provided support in times of crisis. These are precisely the conditions in which drug use flourishes and drug problems proliferate, when people are struggling to survive on inadequate and insecure incomes, when conventional paths to security and dignity and a meaningful life seem closed off or impossibly distant, when the future looks not bright with promise but bleak with continued struggle and decline. These are the conditions in which drugs that provide energy to work longer hours at multiple demanding jobs, or confidence to face social situations when you feel like a failure, or escape from depression and hopelessness, and the grinding stress of poverty, or simply pleasure and relief and excitement in lives that offer little of any of these things, become appealing or even necessary. People do not use methamphetamine in a vacuum. They use it in contexts in response to circumstances, a way of coping with or managing or escaping from conditions that feel unbearable. Addressing the methamphetamine crisis effectively, reducing its toll on individuals and families and communities, requires addressing these underlying conditions and not just treating addiction as an isolated individual pathology or moral failing. It requires economic policies that create genuine opportunities for people in communities that have been systematically devastated by deindustrialization and economic restructuring and decades of policy choices that favored capital over labor, corporations over workers, the wealthy over everyone else. It requires investment in education that prepares people for the economy that actually exists rather than for an economy that disappeared a generation ago, that provides not just academic knowledge but practical skills, that is accessible and affordable, rather than being restricted to those whose families can pay or who are willing to take on crippling debt. It requires massive infrastructure investment that both creates jobs directly in construction and maintenance and rebuilds the physical foundations that communities need to thrive, the roads and bridges and water systems and broadband internet access that modern economic activity requires. It requires healthcare policies that ensure everyone has access to quality care, including mental health services and addiction treatment, not as a privilege for those who can afford it, but as a right of citizenship and human dignity. It requires labor policies that give workers more bargaining power and ensure that wages keep pace with productivity and cost of living, that provide protection against arbitrary dismissal and exploitation, that allow people to organize and collectively bargain for better conditions. It requires housing policies that ensure everyone has access to safe, stable, affordable housing, not as a commodity for investment and speculation, but as a fundamental human need and prerequisite for participating successfully in society. It requires all the investments in public goods and social infrastructure that help communities and individuals thrive, the parks and libraries and community centers and youth programs that give people places to go and things to do and opportunities to connect with others. It requires rebuilding the social institutions and connections that give people's lives meaning and support, though how exactly to do this in a changed social and economic landscape is far from clear. These are not drug policy measures in the narrow technical sense of the term. They will not be found in any manual on addiction treatment or harm reduction or drug law enforcement, but they are absolutely essential, crucial, indispensable components of any comprehensive response to the methamphetamine crisis, because they address the demand side of the equation, the reasons why people turn to drugs in the first place, the conditions that make drug use appealing or functional or necessary for so many people. Without addressing these fundamental issues of economic security and opportunity, of community strength and social connection, of hope and meaning and a realistic stake in a positive future, efforts to reduce drug use and drug-related harm through treatment and enforcement, and even harm reduction will continue to be overwhelmed by the tide of despair and dysfunction, and lack of alternatives that creates and sustains demand. The story of methamphetamine, the long arc from sacred leaf used in traditional medicine to super soldier drug deployed in total war to global plague, devastating communities, is ultimately a story about us, about human societies and what we value and prioritize, about how we treat people who are suffering, about whether we are willing to face hard truths and change course when our policies and approaches are clearly failing. It is a story that reveals with uncomfortable clarity how science and technology can be both miraculous and terrible, how the same knowledge and capabilities that allow us to develop effective medicines and improve human welfare can be turned to create weapons and tools of destruction and control. It is a story about markets and their remarkable power and resilience, about how prohibition creates illegal markets that respond to demand with entrepreneurial creativity, about how attempts to suppress supply through enforcement create opportunities for violence and corruption and innovation in production and distribution. It is a story about inequality and its consequences, about how those at the bottom of social and economic hierarchies, those with the fewest resources and opportunities and supports, pay the highest price for societal failures and policy mistakes. The wealthy and comfortable may experiment with methamphetamine and face consequences, certainly, but they have resources to access quality treatment, to avoid or minimize contact with the criminal justice system, to rebuild their lives after problems emerge. The poor and marginalized face the full weight of both the drug's harms and society's punitive response, cycling through emergency rooms and jails and prisons, unable to access effective treatment, facing barriers at every turn as they try to rebuild their lives. But it is also importantly, crucially, a story of resilience and recovery, of the extraordinary and often underestimated capacity of human beings to survive terrible damage and to heal even from profound harm. It is a story of people who find their way back from the edge of destruction, who rebuild their lives one day at a time, often with minimal support and in the face of enormous obstacles and barriers. It is a story of communities that refuse to give up on their struggling members, that create informal and formal networks of support and care even when official institutions fail them or actively harm them. It is a story of advocates and activists and harm reduction workers and treatment providers who show up every day to help people, who treat people with dignity and compassion regardless of their choices and circumstances, who persist in demanding better policies and better systems despite political obstacles and public indifference and sometimes active hostility. As we look forward from this moment, the trajectory of the methamphetamine crisis remains deeply uncertain, dependent on choices not yet made, on policies not yet implemented, on social changes not yet achieved. It could worsen significantly, driven by ever more potent and dangerous drug supplies, by continued adulteration with fentanyl and other unpredictable substances, by continued social and economic deterioration in the communities most affected, by inadequate policy responses and insufficient investment in the approaches that evidence suggests actually work. or it could gradually improve as we implement more effective approaches at scale, as treatment and harm reduction services expand and improve in quality and accessibility, as we begin seriously to address some of the underlying social and economic conditions that drive drug use, as public understanding evolves and stigma decreases, and we begin to treat drug use and addiction as the complex health and social issues they are rather than primarily as criminal justice problems. Most likely, the reality will be complex and mixed and uneven, with genuine progress in some areas and dimensions coexisting with setbacks and continued problems in others, with innovation and resistance, with small victories and ongoing struggles, with the slow, grinding, often frustrating work of helping people one at a time while also trying to change the systems and conditions that create the crisis. What is certain, what we can say with confidence, is that the crisis will not resolve itself, will not simply fade away through benign neglect or the passage of time. It will require sustained attention and commitment and resources and political will over many years, probably over decades. It will require difficult choices about how we allocate limited resources, about what kind of society we want to be, about how we balance competing values and priorities, about what obligations we have to people who are struggling and suffering, and the choices we make now, the policies we implement or fail to implement, the investments we make or fail to make in treatment and prevention and harm reduction and addressing underlying conditions, will shape outcomes not just for the current generation of people affected by methamphetamine, but for generations to come. The children growing up now in families and communities affected by methamphetamine, experiencing trauma and instability and sometimes neglect, will carry the effects throughout their lives, and their life trajectories will be profoundly shaped by whether we provide them with support and opportunity and pathways to better futures, or whether we leave them to cope with trauma and adversity largely on their own, with minimal support. The history of methamphetamine is in the end a mirror held up to modern civilization, reflecting back to us both our remarkable capacities and achievements and our profound failures and blind spots. It shows what we can achieve when we apply scientific knowledge and industrial capabilities to solving problems, the medicines we can develop, the productivity we can unlock, but also how those same capabilities can be turned to destructive purposes when deployed without adequate ethical consideration or social safeguards or concern for long-term consequences. It shows our creativity and ingenuity in synthesizing new compounds and building complex global supply chains and distribution networks, but also our inability or unwillingness to address the social and economic conditions that create demand for these substances, or to implement the policies and programs that evidence consistently suggests would reduce their harms. It shows our capacity for compassion and care and mutual support, our ability to help people in crisis and to create communities of recovery and resilience, but also our tendency toward cruelty and punishment and stigmatization, our eagerness to blame and punish people for their struggles rather than to help them, our comfort with enormous disparities in how consequences are distributed based on wealth and race and social position. It shows how policies shaped by fear and ideology and political calculation and moral panic can persist for decades, despite overwhelming evidence of their failure and their harm, because changing course requires admitting mistakes, because powerful vested interests benefit from current approaches, because the political incentives favor continued tough-on-crime posturing over patient evidence-based reform. And it shows how difficult but how necessary it is to change course, to try different approaches, to keep working toward better solutions even when progress is frustratingly slow and setbacks are frequent and the problems can seem overwhelming and intractable, to maintain hope and commitment even in the face of a crisis that has resisted our best efforts at resolution for decades now. We are not powerless in the face of this crisis. We have knowledge that previous generations lacked. Scientific understanding of addiction and recovery built on decades of rigorous research and clinical experience. Evidence about what interventions work and what interventions fail or actively make things worse. Carefully documented examples from other countries that have implemented radically different approaches, with demonstrably better results that we could learn from and adapt to our own contexts. We have resources, vast wealth concentrated in our societies that could be directed toward addressing this problem comprehensively, if we chose to prioritize it over other uses of public money, if we decided that human lives and communities mattered as much as military spending or corporate subsidies or the interests of the wealthy. We have the institutional capacity to change, to implement new policies through our democratic processes however imperfect they may be, to build new systems and structures of care and support, to try different approaches and learn from the results, We have talented, dedicated people working in treatment and harm reduction and advocacy who know what needs to be done, and who are ready to do the work if given the resources and political support. What we have lacked, what we continue to lack, is not knowledge or resources or capacity, but will, the political and social will to make the changes that evidence consistently and overwhelmingly suggests are necessary, to challenge the deeply embedded assumptions and ideologies and vested interests that have shaped our failed policies for generations, to invest seriously and sustainably in prevention and treatment and harm reduction and addressing the root causes that drive drug use, rather than continuing to rely primarily on punishment and interdiction and stigmatization, approaches that decades of experience and mountains of evidence show to be inadequate at best, and actively counterproductive at worst. The complete history of methamphetamine, the long arc from its origins as a humble plant used in traditional Chinese medicine through its transformation into a super-soldier drug deployed in the largest and most destructive war in human history to its current status as a driver of a devastating public health crisis that tears apart families and communities, is a history that we are still writing, still living, still creating moment by moment through our choices and actions and policies and the values we choose to prioritize. We are not passive observers of this unfolding story, but active participants with agency and responsibility. The future is not predetermined or inevitable, not written in stone or fixed by forces beyond our control. It will be shaped, for better or worse, by the choices we make as individuals and as communities and as a society. Today and in the days and months and years ahead, we can choose to continue down the path we have been on for the past half-century, the path of criminalization and punishment and mass incarceration, the path that has demonstrably failed to reduce drug use or drug-related harm, but has succeeded brilliantly in filling prisons and destroying lives and communities, and costing taxpayers trillions of dollars. Or we can choose differently. We can choose evidence over ideology, choosing to implement the approaches that research shows actually work rather than the approaches that feel satisfying or that align with our moral intuitions about punishment and accountability. We can choose compassion over cruelty, recognizing that people who use drugs are human beings deserving of dignity and care rather than criminals deserving of punishment. We can choose health over criminalization, treating drug use as primarily a public health issue requiring medical and social interventions rather than primarily a criminal justice issue requiring punishment. We can choose investment in people and communities over investment in prisons and enforcement, directing our substantial resources toward creating the conditions where people can thrive rather than toward punishing them when they struggle. These choices are not easy, and they face substantial political obstacles and cultural resistance, but they are possible, they are within our power, and they are necessary if we hope to make meaningful progress on this crisis that has resisted our efforts for so long. The choice is ours to make, individually, in how we think about and respond to drug use in our families and communities, collectively in the policies we support and the politicians we elect and the priorities we set as a society. The consequences of our choices will be ours as well, and will be felt most acutely and most painfully by the most vulnerable among us, by the people currently struggling with addiction who need help rather than punishment, by their families and loved ones who suffer alongside them, by their communities that are torn apart by both the crisis itself and by our societal response to it, by the children growing up in the shadow of this crisis whose futures are being shaped by trauma and instability, and the choices we make or fail to make today. Thank you for staying with me through this long, complex, often difficult and sometimes painful journey through the complete history of methamphetamine. If you found value in this exploration, if it challenged your thinking or deepened your understanding or gave you new perspectives on this crisis, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel for more deep investigations into the histories and forces that shape our present and will shape our future. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your own experiences if you feel comfortable and safe doing so, your questions and reflections and disagreements. These conversations matter profoundly. They help shape understanding and challenge assumptions. They help build the foundation for change, for better policies, for more compassionate responses. They help us see each other as human beings struggling with shared challenges and complex realities rather than as categories or statistics or problems to be solved or threats to be eliminated. And please remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with substance use, help is available. You are not alone in this struggle, even when it feels isolating and shameful and hopeless. You are not beyond help or redemption, no matter how far you think you have fallen or how much damage you think you have done. Recovery is possible, however difficult and however long the road may be, however many attempts it takes, however many setbacks you experience along the way. Reach out to treatment providers, to mutual aid groups, to harm reduction services, to anyone who might help. Keep trying, even when it feels impossible. Connect with others who understand, who have walked this path, who know the struggles and the fears and the small victories. There is always hope, even in the darkest moments, even when it seems most distant and most impossible to imagine. The human capacity for healing and change and resilience and renewal is far greater than we often imagine or believe possible. Do not give up on yourself or on those you love. Do not let shame or stigma prevent you from seeking help. Do not let past failures convince you that change is impossible. Every moment is a new opportunity. Every day is a chance to choose differently. Good night, and may you find peace and healing and connection and meaning in whatever form they come to you.